We are very happy to have James Binning here today. He's a founding member of Studio Assemble. We were supposed to do this talk the 16th of March 2020. And we know that Friday 13th of March, we closed down. So I had the unfortunate task of kind of canceling everybody's journey to Oslo. But we're very happy now that we have him with us. Assemble was given the assignment to create we didn't call it a pre-project at that in the beginning, but I call it that now, because when we started our collaboration with Assemble, we started with conversations and discussions on what they could do for us. And I think it was very important that James and other parts of the Studio Assemble came here, talked to us about kind of the situation we were in and what we were trying to do. That's how I feel the process went, and that James kind of constructed his project on the basis of our needs and the needs of this area, and not so much kind of your previous projects, but kind of the situation that you were met with here. His pre-project is called Art in Hovinbyen, an atlas for art in Hovinbyen. Since it's been 2 years, we only have 5 copies left of the physical format. I have them here. We have it in the PDF, and maybe at a later stage we will have money to print new ones. But we've been active kind of distributing them, and I will send you all a link to the PDF after the seminar. So welcome, James. I will give the word to you.
Do I use? Okay, no, I'm fine. Mic'd up. Yeah, hi. So I'm James from Assemble, as Mari said, and we're a group of around 15 people that work in quite a loose kind of collective structure now for about 10 or 12 years. I thought it'd be useful to just briefly introduce kind of the range of work that we do and maybe provide some context to why we were asked to kind of come and work with Kuru in the city on developing this kind of pre-project. And so our work started out working in context of urban development. The first project we did really was taking over a out-of-use petrol station on an urban site in the City of London, and running that as a completely open construction site where anybody could kind of come and participate in the construction of a cinema over a 6-week build period, where we then ran a kind of program of films and things and produced after the 6 weeks for £5,000, so around 50,000 Norwegian kroner, this kind of project, which then ran all summer, putting on movies and other things. So quite a sort of direct engagement with urban development processes and things, and an emphasis on kind of hands-on methods of production that were quite inclusive. We've since kind of moved on to set up a series of workspaces that try to provide a more formal infrastructure within often existing buildings or places, sites that are scheduled for redevelopment. So these kind of meanwhile use opportunities. So we now run 5 sites in London and are looking to do a development project which will make a more kind of permanent home for around 150 people that we support across different workspaces, from kind of textile designers and manufacturers through to artists, graphic designers, joiners. As you can see here, they're kind of quite scrappy kind of workshop facilities. And at times have also got involved in the construction of projects ourselves. So this was the construction of a new low-cost studio space in quite near the Olympic Park, as a sort of more formal effort to increase provision for artists and people that make stuff in a context where a lot of the old industrial spaces were being redeveloped to make space for newer, higher value residential developments that was squeezing out these kinds of uses that we think are very important, kind of culturally and economically, to retain a kind of good mixed city. We also kind of increasingly build things ourselves, even when we're involved in kind of more formal public large-scale construction projects. And since we worked in Oslo, maybe we're also more involved in the kind of strategic development and urban development scale project. So this is a project we're working on actually at the moment in Australia, looking to create a kind of mixed kind of cultural industrial spaces on a site similar to Økern in some ways, kind of redeveloping quite quickly and quite an extensive scale of transformation, but thinking within that about how to make space for many of the uses that already exist in those kinds of places, from kind of coffee roasters, food producers, brewers, and those kinds of industrial uses that, again, often aren't seen as very viable alongside residential uses. And that extends to the design of some of the buildings. But we also have, at times, kind of worked on what might be more conventionally understood as like art or installation projects. This is a project we did recently, which was the headline commission for what's popularly known in the UK as, or unpopularly known in the UK as, the Brexit Festival, which it was a kind of art and light and sound installation. So quite a mixed practice, but I think the projects I use to describe maybe the work that we think, or that we've done, that we feel is maybe most analogous to the kinds of projects we think could be very valuable in the context of Hovinbyen, are a bit different. But that, that sort of gives a context maybe to the range of work that we're involved with at different scales and in different ways. I think that all relates to kind of processes of urban development. And so, we were initially invited to come to Hovinbyen, I think, with quite an open brief. And I think the question really was around what role art might play in a context which is changing as much as Hovinbyen is set to change, or Hovinbyen even as a kind of loose concept. And I think our initial observations partly were relating to the physical context, and I think the description often of a place like this, which is, extensive quantities of industrial use and other things, I think it's often many of those things which already exist are sort of overlooked when people look to a longer term future. So there were lots of terms I think used about the context which didn't necessarily value either the landscape or the kind of economic mix that was already here. And so I think that was an important part of just sort of coming in with a slightly different perspective, maybe in recording those things. But at the same time, I think we're quite interested in the ways that these processes have an impact on the kind of communities and society, I guess, that already exists in these places. And I think something, things which are common to areas like this, but or exist in areas like this, but are common to many other places that are experiencing this scale of change, is that this level of growth has a very disruptive and weakening effect on existing communities. And when we talk about communities, we don't just mean, community in a sort of inclusive and general sense. I think we mean the way that quite specific groups can be impacted. So a community of people that work in the industrial buildings and that make up the kind of industrial economy of the area. An existing community might also be one that wouldn't self-define as that. That could be people who are going to grow up in the next 10 years within an area that is going to be profoundly affected by construction works and constantly sort of reshaped and quite difficult to navigate. So that is definitely one kind of aspect that we see in lots of different contexts. I think the other thing maybe which wasn't necessarily a part of conversations that we had while we were here, but is perhaps exemplified by the fact that those people weren't really very visible or accessible in the course of the time we were spending here, is that young people and old people are increasingly isolated in these kinds of contexts. It's quite different in the UK. That often relates to people being having their houses purchased and then those houses re-provided in other places. There's a sort of physical fragmentation. But I think there's quite a lot of research at this point about the way that increasingly kind of mobile populations and fragmented family structures are having profound impacts on the kind of well-being and experience of younger people and older people in urban places. A common factor, or I think reflection on a lot of the conversations that we had, was the number of times a possible initiative might be reliant on developer goodwill, and the extent to which, to a lesser extent than is the case in the UK and in our familiar experience, but still, obviously, private interests are a massive part and massively shape the opportunity landscape in a place like this. And again, like that's a challenge to sort of resolve the tension that exists between kind of public or sort of wider non-economic interests and the primary kind of interests of the developers that hold a lot of sway. And the extent to some degree that public agencies lack agency. And I don't mean that strictly in relation to developers. I mean that in the sense that often the tools that, say, a planning authority or actually really any department of government to some extent, I think have today to address kind of critical urban or social issues are limited. Most instances, these agencies are still working in ways which have obviously evolved, but are still organised in quite siloed fashions. And the kinds of issues that agencies in the post-war period were set up to address are far more complex now. And I think, one of our interests in a lot of the work that we've done is the way actually in which art practice or a form of art practice can be a way of linking between agencies that otherwise have quite specific agendas to address some of these quite complex issues that we're describing, and I think we're also observing here. And so the next part of the process really was to sort of formulate a bit of an agenda, so to sort of identify this series of constraints and then present them back as a series of opportunities. And I think some of those were never really anticipated to be part of the kind of formal brief that artists might be responding to, and they were probably more observations coming from our background as architects and with an interest in kind of urban design and cities. That would sort of fall probably more on the left side. And then on the right side, maybe a series of points that we thought probably could be quite an open-ended, but also quite compelling agenda for some of these art projects. And so one of those is about projects which can strengthen the social fabric. And I think what we mean by that really is creating situations in which people with different experiences and circumstances can be brought together to, possibly in quite a structured way, negotiate and advocate for the kinds of environments that they need or want within this kind of context. But also actually just make spaces in which people from different demographics or with different experiences can occupy spaces together, which is something which is increasingly uncommon, I think, or a failing of many kind of contemporary developments relative to often more historic situations. I think we were interested also in developing cultural infrastructure, and I think one of the analogies that we made was between this kind of very heterogeneous and varied situation in Hovinbyen and maybe the more historic centre of Oslo, and any city actually, and the diversity that exists often at the periphery, and how to make that more visible or value it in the same way that we value sort of major cultural institutions that typically have, formal architecture and well-established premises in city centres. And that rather than seeking to sort of create something equivalent or to say that, Hovinbyen has culture because it has one or two or three substantive landmark things, to think much more about the way in which you could support or recognise often that more marginal places in the city are the places where the culture is produced that we experience in the centre. It's where the rents are lower and all these other things, and that when often those are pushed out by development, actually the kind of formal kinds of more visible cultural experience that we have can suffer. So I think sort of seeing fundamentally a different opportunity for the way in which culture might be supported in an area like this. I think one of the things that maybe relates back to the young and old point, but not exclusively, is the idea that this project is an opportunity to build meaningful partnerships with local organisations and groups. I think we met some of those organisations. Some of them were part of local businesses in places like Geloftet, and I know they're not specifically in Hovinbyen, but sort of trying to work with what's there as opposed to kind of coming in with, I guess, a set of more abstract ideas and sort of delivering those and expecting that they will sort of find an audience and value. So sort of working slightly more from the ground up. I think the point about this is thinking maybe about a range of projects and how you're developing work or situations which have a very, very broad appeal. I think certainly a lot of the art funding in the UK at the moment, certainly a lot of the funding for, say, something like that Brexit Festival that we were involved with, ends up being targeted, or even if not targeted, kind of accessed by quite a narrow cross-section of society, actually. And I think that felt explicitly like an important thing to challenge in this context. And then also to think about how the role of agencies could be recast through an engagement, I think, with the tools and skills of artists and art practice. And actually, I think there were some very interesting historic examples of that at some points in the UK, and in other places it gained a kind of currency with organisations like the Artist Placement Group. And really, I guess, seeing the opportunity maybe not for commissioning kind of art projects in a formal sense, but to recognise that fundamentally in contemporary agencies and the economy and generally, there's a lot of value placed on the kind of creative skills, problem solving and all of these things, and that actually those are skills which artists possess in abundance. And the kind of license that we often allow artists to operate in, kind of outside of regular norms and frameworks, with a certain degree of autonomy and an open-endedness about what the outcome might be, is exactly the kind of thinking and production maybe that is needed to address some of the kind of sticky and difficult issues, I think, that are existing in a place like this when it's in a kind of process of change, but also that just contribute to making kind of richer and more varied places as well. I think something which is maybe quite important to sort of state quite clearly, and which we talked about a lot in the process, was kind of our position on culture generally. And obviously we are an organisation of professionals with diverse kind of professional backgrounds and experience at this point. But I think we, having started very young, we set up Assemble when we were 22, with actually a relatively low level of confidence or authority. We weren't really able to go out and assert a strong vision for what we wanted to do in places. All of our work was necessarily kind of negotiated with the people that we were working with in different places, often that we didn't fully understand or have a lot of experience of. And I think we, drew a lot of value, or it felt like probably less of a kind of guiding principle, but more of a way of helpfully understanding the way that other people had thought about our situation and the kinds of work we were making, to kind of acknowledge the our role was, although we've often, through prizes and other things, been sort of celebrated as people that have a special creative skill or whatever, as artists or architects, that actually within projects our role often feels like more of a kind of technical one, or one certainly that's always working, when it's working well, in support of an ability or a capacity or an energy that already exists in a place, and that we're never really trying to kind of co-opt other people to produce our work, but thinking about how our skills and things can be used often to sort of build and make something special in a context that without our skills simply wouldn't be possible. But I think this is very important because in the context of public art commissioning, certainly in the UK, there is a sort of a narrative that the responsibility and sort of value in public art funding is to support artists, and the artists should be supported to produce work, and that work has a direct impact and is sort of justifiable on the basis that people are able to experience that work made by that artist. And actually, I don't disagree with that, and I think you can make very special and spectacular projects in that way. But what is completely underappreciated maybe is also the way in which a different process can produce, often for much more limited resources, I think far greater impact and inclusivity, and actually make much richer projects. And in urban development contexts, I think that is particularly possible because of the kind of disruption and opportunity and that these development processes open up in terms of meanwhile spaces and just kind of new spatial but also material opportunities maybe within cities which often otherwise are quite closed off. And in that respect, this point feels important. It's from the same book, The Theory of Loose Parts by Simon Nicholson. And so, whilst we were never coming in to sort of propose an alternative master plan or really engage, I think, with the fabric of the built environment in a specific way, the idea that actually, there is both like the artifact of the city as a physical space, but also the kind of cultural and social life of it as an environment. That environment can be enriched enormously by creating a large number of variables within it. And I think that, in a way, is the kind of purpose or maybe the greatest value that we saw in the Art and Hovinbyen project as a kind of commissioning framework. So I'm going to talk kind of briefly about 3 projects that we've done. Not so much about the projects maybe, but about ideas that we think are quite critical to the work that we make. And one is about inclusivity, not exclusivity. And that might sound like an obvious point, but I think in relation to a kind of language often around placemaking in urban development, what is often being talked about actually is explicitly exclusive. You don't make a place to make it like every other place. You make a place to make it distinct. And I think that is really intrinsically linked to a kind of commercial agenda that exists within development that's totally, normal and logical and not immutable. I'm not saying that that's something that a project of this scale can contest with. But when you think about public art as a placemaking tool, I think actually it fundamentally isn't about inclusivity. And in thinking about like what our role or what value then we might be able to bring to making public spaces that are more inclusive, actually often we found play to be a very important tool. So sometimes working with this project specifically with a developer, Argent, on a major site in London that's now been extended to a number of other sites across London as a kind of longer term project, but which initially began as a summer-long pilot project, funded, I think, for around £20,000. We set up an organisation called Assemble Play that provided loose parts play and 2 freelance play workers to supervise kids' play in a public space throughout the summer. And over the course of that summer, something like 5,000 children came to a variety of spaces around the development, often returning regularly, often with parents or grandparents, and within a neighbourhood which is where there's massive new kind of Facebook and Google campuses. There's a lot of extremely expensive new housing being built alongside historic communities of kind of social and public housing. A project like that is quite extraordinarily, well, I think quite unique in the context in being able to attract people from all of those communities, and through play, enabling a context where they can also stay and access, just use that public space for hours at a time. And so instead of it being a kind of placemaking tool explicitly, it did have a commercial value that the developer saw, because people coming and spending time there makes it a destination in its own right. But it also has commercial value to the other businesses and things that are around that are selling coffee and food and all of this other stuff, which is the reason, it's sort of cold financial logic that means that project has been extended to other sites, not just because it's a nice thing to do. And I think whilst that project is quite visual, and it's also quite messy, and I think an extraordinary sort of rupture and strange thing to see, to go to a public space that looks like it's been turned into some kind of giant den, or just a massive dressing up box has been spilled all over the square. It's not very controlled. It's not very authored in a way. It really is about just providing loose materials and allowing children to explore and experience a space in a way that's very different to the very sort of regimented and structured environments that playgrounds are typically designed as these days. But in terms of the transformation of that public space, and as what we consider to be our employment of our skills as designers and artists, and leveraging really the autonomy and sort of freedom that artists are given, I think that has been and continues to be a very successful and economical public art project that has a very regular audience of people using it every week, numbering in the hundreds of kind of families and children that come and use it on a weekly basis. I think there's something like 25,000 followers on Instagram and things. So as a project which, in terms of the direct experience of that space, has completely transformed it for relatively limited means, but which also fulfills the kind of developer's ambition of kind of representing this space as something quite distinctive, maybe, rather than exclusive. I think it's been very successful. And a slightly different example would be a project that we set up in Glasgow in 2014 in response to a sculpture commission as part of the Commonwealth Games. So Glasgow at the time, particularly East Glasgow, a bit like this area, was being completely transformed by new housing and sports infrastructure, and that process was going to last, well, is ongoing. It'll last till about 2030. And in this context, we said, you don't need a sculpture to sort of edify and sort of celebrate the games. The thing maybe to understand is that in order to build these stadiums, you've built these car parks and you've removed actually 5, they weren't great playgrounds anyway, but any kind of play provision for kids in the local area was lost. And we said instead of that sort of sculpture, you could invest in a new playground that's different to all the other ones. It builds a relationship with the contractors who are going to be here for a long time by taking materials from their sites and just re-providing them as loose materials in this space, again, which was then just supervised by a couple of adults to enable children to experience it in a very quite wild way. And it's very unaesthetic. This project was like this for about a year. A lot of mud, spades, saws, bricks, bits of construction tubing that kids rolled around in. And over time then, it kind of built up into something a bit more formal, a child-led space with a clear set of rules, a formal infrastructure. It's established now as a charity. And what started as, a play project open for a couple of hours a day, over something like the pandemic grew into effectively a kind of community-organised public service providing meals for kids who weren't going to school in an area where there's quite acute levels of child poverty. There's massive amounts of involvement from local parents and things in the running of this organisation. And over time, that sort of built up into something which is a bit more aesthetic and a bit more varied. And so I think, again, the kind of concept for that, or I guess it's the creative life of this space, is in the kind of constant making and remaking by children of their environments. Artists actually do come in and do residencies within this space, but they tend to then effectively run 2 or 3 week-long workshops with kids And so it's even those situations are quite child-led, but it's seeing the artist's involvement as a kind of resource for an existing community that can change and improve or amend that environment, as opposed to being about kind of enabling children to participate in a specific project that's authored by an artist. Yeah, and I guess in terms of impact, it's probably similar in costs to a project which has been done recently for COP26 around Glasgow to sort of repaint a series of public spaces, which has been very successful in terms of the as a kind of rebranding, I guess, or kind of transformation of a series of slightly worn through public spaces. But in terms of the kind of productive or like cultural richness and variety that happens in this space on a daily basis, compared to, say, the spaces around King's Cross or the Baltic Street Playground, I think there's no comparison really. And whilst this is kind of recognisably an artist-authored project, and it does make great images and it has improved the space, for the resources available, I think the kind of impact kind of socially, but also in terms of the public life of the environment it isn't comparable. I think the second point is about sort of partnership rather than participation. I think we certainly started off in projects around 10 years ago being very interested in participation, and we authored these projects like this cinema project or the other large-scale collective build projects that enable people to come in and work with us for a summer or for a day on helping build something that we had a big stake in. But I think increasingly we're interested really in the way that we can take more of a back seat and set up things which can take on their own life over time in the spirit of things like the Mechanics Institutes and free libraries, which were sort of a Ruskinian legacy. So I guess at the same time that you've got public libraries as sort of formal institutions where people can go to learn things, you have these kinds of other spaces starting up which are all about self-education, kind of mutual learning and cooperative support, and global, very successful sort of franchise movements like Men's Shed, which is ostensibly a space where men can go into their little cave, make some matchstick boats and things like that. But by doing that in a kind of collective forum instead of individually, actually these spaces have become quite powerful spaces, although a bit, I think they're not always men's sheds these days, I think, as the movement has developed slightly and got a bit more perspective. But they do provide quite a unique space for all kinds of discussions and sort of workshops and other things with that age group who otherwise are actually, quite difficult to access in lots of situations. And so in that sort of spirit, I think in 2015 we set up a workshop in North London in an empty building that was initially available only for 2 years. Again, it was a sort of pilot phase. Through the pilot phase, we were able to demonstrate actually that there was a massive appetite for people to be involved in kind of DIY production, or even sort of amateur making, learning new craft skills, or also doing basic level qualifications in technical courses. So this space sort of provides everything really, from a kind of drop-in to use a kind of saw or a tool, have a coffee, buy some bread, to do a simple qualification, through to professional level maker spaces. So again, it's quite a sort of mixed community of people. And I think that part of the success of that space has been the variety. So our role in it really was setting it up. I think in this context, we sort of refer to it as a sort of, instead of making the thing, you make the thing that makes the thing. And by using that initial money in that way, and it's similar with the playground, it enables it to kind of be constantly resourceful and productive in all variety of ways, as opposed to a kind of single way in which we might have initially sort of realised a project. So quite a successful infrastructure. It has a massive reach, especially at a point where workshop facilities are being taken out of many secondary schools. It has become a kind of place where lots of people go to get access to kinds of teaching that doesn't really happen in school anymore, and has provided lots of opportunities for other people who probably wouldn't describe themselves as artists or, professional makers or other things, to build, a business around delivering workshops or making things in quite a supportive kind of community. So again, in terms of like providing access, that feels like a very successful project. And I think, it's something which when we talk about sort of working with local groups, our role in this was really to find somebody locally who we could work with to act as the director of the space. We're not always working, when we talk about that, with whole communities of people, but we're also not sort of making ourselves the director of that space. We have a more hands-off role. And I think the other thing often, or that feels kind of important to talk about in the context of principles for the projects we were interested in making here, is about foundations, not fireworks. I think we were, after those first series of projects that we did, we were very often approached to do things which would have been one-off and kind of public spectacles or events. And it's not to say that we don't see value in more singular, special, and spectacular kind of artist-led projects which don't have such a legacy. But I think through having the opportunity to make certain kinds of projects which are a bit more infrastructural, in terms of providing facilities that other people can use, we just feel like, or increasingly we were trying to move away from doing projects which are very energy intensive and also engage a lot of people in terms of time and energy, and to make things which could be more self-sustaining, and possibly also engage with other problems like economy, jobs, skills, and these kinds of hard things that aren't often considered to be the business of kind of an art project, maybe to address. But through kind of projects in an area of Liverpool, where we've been working for the last 8 years, with a very, very complex history of kind of battles really between local people and the authorities and the police. This area became very depressed, a lot of boarded up houses, as you can see here. And within that context, there was a real sort of DIY, and I think very creative spirit that the residents that remained in this neighbourhood kind of applied to completely transform this neighbourhood from something which felt quite militarised into something which felt very rich and varied and completely different actually to any other area of the city, in spite of a real lack of investment. And so whilst the exterior was quite rich, the interiors of these houses were in awful condition in most cases. I mean, of 400 homes or something, I think only 20 were occupied. And most of the ones that weren't occupied were in this sort of state. And we did a very, very simple project there to refurbish these houses at very low cost. Very simple, not particularly inventive kind of refits. But we also tried to think about a kind of role that we might have that could sort of further support and put in place something longer term that could build on the kind of DIY and creative spirit of the residents who transformed the neighbourhoods there. And we took over a small vacant shop unit for 6 months, put out a completely open call to local people. So you didn't need any skills. If you had them, great. But if you were interested in learning some skills in a variety of different production techniques, you could become part of the workshop's pilot phase. And we produced a vast array of different ceramic, cast concrete, kind of graphic items, effectively like a whole catalogue of products that we then used to furnish the houses, to generate revenue, to reinvest in the project, and ultimately set up a business, Granby Workshop, which continues to do that today. It's more focused now on architectural ceramics, but we transferred that business into community ownership, so it's run by the employees of that business. Again, we have like kind of back seat supporting role. And I guess in all of these projects, some of them, like we can take photos like this, that are quite powerful images. We recognise the value of that, but I'm also happy to show pictures of a muddy field with kids playing around in it. it doesn't look like a lot. Places like adventure playgrounds or workshops kind of often don't, and even, you know, the early weeks of the project in King's Cross, you know, in otherwise a very controlled urban environment, were quite problematic, I think, for developers initially to sort of engage with. But I think one of the things we have recognised is by taking seriously how we demonstrate and talk about the impact of those projects in terms of like people genuinely accessing them, the breadth maybe of and cross-section of society that's coming to use and use again and again these projects, and the variety of cultural outputs that are coming from them, you know, that are visible on Instagram and other things, but also in, you know, the number of like company listings that exist at a place like Black Horse Workshop. Some of these things look messy, and I sort of deliberately show some of the less, you know, attractive images of them, because I think, you know, when you're able to look at a project like Baltic Street and say, we invested £120,000 in that project to begin with to get a lease on the land, hire some play workers, put in place the charity structure, and that it's now got 500 regular users a week in a place where there were previously no playgrounds. It delivers free school meals. It has a partnership with local supermarkets that enables sort of it to operate as a food bank for people other than just the children. Like that to us is an extraordinarily impactful art project that nobody else but an artist could have delivered by utilising a variety of different kinds of kind of public resources, but also kind of leveraging the license and sort of trust that is often granted to kind of artists to operate in ways which are difficult to tolerate or too risky for other kinds of organisation. So there are a number of questions I think that came out of the Hovinbyen work. You know, I think maybe we can reflect on some of these now. They're in the back of the document as well. But yeah, I think hopefully that gives a kind of brief overview of, you know, what I think we observed in Hovinbyen and what we felt were some of the kind of critical issues to us having spent some time here at the beginning of the project. And a series of things that we felt like were quite important principles in making kind of work that can do more than just ameliorate, I think, the difficulties that exist within places that are changing to this extent, and how relatively small levels of investment in, I think, art practice rather than art projects maybe can create kind of more inclusive and quite dynamic and very impactful long-term initiatives in places that can have quite profound and unexpected also impacts. And that's where I wanted to finish. So yeah, thank you very much.